Hey, y'all, and welcome. We are back for another episode in this Black History Month, and we're talking about funk. We are true funketeers over here. But that influence that it made on our history is phenomenal. So stay tuned, and we're going to get into that topic in just a moment. But of course, we always got to give glory and honor to God for giving us this opportunity, this platform to share with you from so many topics around God, marriage, family, and life. But of course, we want to also give a shout out to our son, Ben Sudderth III, Mr. Podcaster or Podfather. He is the CEO of the network that we are part of, BS3 Network. And if you're not aware, we are on Roku TV. If you have not downloaded us yet, please do so. That information is on your screen. Make sure you put a space in between BS3 and Network, and you'll find over 30 different podcasters. And we, again, offer topics around sports, life, music, family, spirituality, marriage, relationships, education, comedy, politics, society, culture, movie and TV reviews. Right. So there's so much for your entertainment pleasure on BS3 Network. And BS3 also offers coaching if you're interested in getting into the podcast arena, whether if it's with BS3 Network or not. He is so unselfishly offering training and coaching in that area. So we encourage you to reach out to him. His website is on your screen. And our email address, if you want to reach out to Sudds-R-Us podcast with any possible topics, comments, kudos. We accept it all. That's it. That's right. Reach out to us at Sudds-R-Us@gmail.com. So I just want to add, we grew up listening to early and big band jazz. My mother had it all from, Louis Armstrong to blues, the B.B. King, and then she come on up to, some of the artists we're going to talk about today. But in high school and college, we were introduced to smooth jazz, if you will. And so I thought I was, grown by then. It's like, wow, this is cool music. And to hear, all of that during our lifetime, it's really a blessing because we're able to now share some of that music with our grandchildren so that they can be well-rounded in all the genres of music. Right. But our love, my husband really introduced me to so much when we were dating that, our love now as we matured did become, smooth jazz until George Clinton and all those guys came into play. And so we really gravitated towards the funk. So we're going to be talking about that today, the Godfather of funk. I know you know who that is. And we're going to get a little bit into George Clinton and Bootsy Collins, as well as Sly Stone. So I know I've given it all away. Oh, well, I'm sorry. But anyway, we're ready to get started in this episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you're watching the replay, we appreciate that too. So let's get started with the show. I apologize. I let the let the cat and the dog out of the bag.
Try to be suspenseful, and bring my presentation with some suspense. But we want you to continue to share and comment when you're tuning in. Please. Like. All of that just helps us grow our podcast. But we started out with this Black History. It's no longer Black History Month. Now it's a Black History Moment. We over February. Right. But we know we celebrate Black History 365, 24/7 anyway.
That's right.
But this is our Black History Moment. We're going to continue on with this part 4. Like Irene said, we started out with gospel and then R&B, soul, and then jazz. But now, last week we talked about Buddy Bolden, and one of what we consider the king and father of jazz. One of his numbers was Funky Butt. later known as Buddy Bolden's blues, which represents one of the earliest references to the concept of funk in popular music way back in the early 1900s. Now, funk is a music genre that originated in the African American community in the mid 1960s, when musicians created a rhythmic, danceable new form of music through a mixture of soul, jazz, and rhythm and blues.
Right.
But what it did, though, it de-emphasized melody and chord progressions and focused on a strong rhythmic groove of a bass line played with electric bass and a drum part played by a percussionist, often at a slow tempo than other popular music. Now, funk typically consisted of a complex percussion groove with rhythm instruments playing interlocking grooves that create a hypnotic and danceable feel. Funk uses the same richly colored extended chords found in the bebop jazz, such as a minor chord with added 7th and 11th or dominant 7th chords with alternate 9th and 11th notes. So funk derivatives include the Abbott funk and Abbott grade strain of funk, boogie, a hybrid electric music and funk, funk metal, a mix of funk and metal, G-funk, a mix of gangster rap and funk, timba, a form of funky Cuban dance music, and funk jam. It is also the main influence of Washington go-go, a funk subgenre. Funk samples and break beats have been used extensively in the hip-hop and electronic dance music. But the king of funk is none other than James Joseph Brown, born May the 3rd in 1933 in Barnwell, South Carolina, to a 16-year-old Susie Beline. She was born in 1916 and 2004, and to a 21-year-old Joseph Gardner Brown, who was born 1912 and passed in 1993. James Brown was born in a small wooden shack. Brown's name was supposed to have been Joseph James Brown, so his first name would have been like his father's name. But unfortunately, the first and middle name was mistakenly reversed on his birth certificate.
Wow.
Which was a common practice back then.
It happened a lot.
Because those in charge, they didn't care about how accurate the information was for black babies. For an example, my date of birth, which is the day I was born, is off by 1 day. And my mother and sister-in-law name is spelled wrong on the birth certificate.
It's a totally wrong name. Like her middle name is not correct at all. My mother's name was the same way.
So that's common.
Very common.
In the black community to have your name or date wrong on your birth certificate. But in his autobiography, Brown stated that he had Chinese and Native American ancestry. That his father was African American and Native American, and his mother was African American and Asian descent, which is probably evident of his height, his eyes, and his voice. He said, "Hey, yo, look."
I can't understand a word he's saying.
So the Brown family, they live in extreme poverty in Elko, South Carolina, which was an impoverished town at the time. They later moved to Augusta, Georgia, where James was around 4 or 5 years old.
Right.
Now, I had some cousins that lived in Augusta, Georgia, the Farrell family. And my uncle, which is my cousin's father, married my mother's sister. And strangely enough, he kind of favored James Brown. He was short and dark-skinned. But the thing about it is their house, and my cousin always reminds me of this, was over a ravine behind his old store/club.
That's right.
Now, my uncle was stationed at the same army base where I'm going to mention later, where James Brown entertained some servicemen. Their house was right behind that ravine, so he always reminds me we was right behind James Brown's club or store. Now, Brown's family first settled at his aunt's brothels. They later moved into a house shared with another aunt. Brown's mother eventually left the family after a contentious and abusive marriage, and she moved to New York. So James Brown spent a lot of his time on his own, hanging out in the streets and hustling to get by, which explains why he was abusive to his wife and girlfriends, because he had a rough upbringing. They say he was brought up on the wrong side of the tracks.
No excuse to be abusive.
And no excuse to be abusive. I'm not trying to condone it. I'm just explaining why. And he witnessed a lot. But he still managed to stay in school until the 6th grade. Now, he began singing in talent shows as a young child, first appearing at Augusta Lenox Theater in 1944, winning the Soul After Music Award singing ball, and he sung So Long. While in Augusta, Brown performed buck dances for change to entertain the troops from Camp Gordon, like I mentioned, at the start of the World War II, as their convoy traveled over a canal bridge near his aunt's home. Now, I think they was visiting the brothel for something else, if you know what I mean. But anyway, he learned to play the piano, guitar, harmonica. During this period, he became inspired to become an entertainer after hearing Caledonia by Lewis Gordon and his Timpani Five in his teen years. Brown briefly had a career as a boxer as well. At the age of 16, he was convicted of robbery. Now, in the movie Get On Up, it says he stole a suit. But they said he stole the suit and he went to Juvenile Detention Center in Toccoa. There he formed a gospel quartet with 4 fellow cellmates, including Johnny Terry. And Brown met singer Bobby Bird when they were playing a baseball game outside of the detention center to keep the young men active. Bird also discovered that Brown could sing after hearing a guy call him Music Box, which was his nickname while he was in prison. And he did have a music box. Bird also claimed he and his family helped to secure an early release, which led to Brown promising the court he would sing for the Lord. These episodes happened for a reason, my brothers and sisters, because God had a purpose and a plan for James Brown. That's why one of his favorite saying is, good God. But Romans 8:28-29 says, and we know that all things work together for the good of them that love God, to them who are called according to his purpose, for whom he did foreknow, he also did predestinate to be conformed to the image of his son, that he might be the firstborn among many brethren. Brown was released on a work sponsorship with Toco business owner S.C. Lawson, and Lawson was impressed with Brown's work ethic and secured in the way he was able to come and be dedicated and committed, so he was released if he promised to keep his employment for 2 years. James Brown was paroled in June 14th, 1952, and Brown went on to work with both Lawson's sons and would come back and visit the family from time to time throughout his career. Shortly after being paroled, he joined the gospel group, Ever Ready Gospel Singers, featuring Bird's sister Sarah. He was a singer, a dancer, a musician. I told you the instruments that he played. He later became a record producer, songwriter, band leader, promoter, and founder of a record company. So the central progenitor of funk music and a major figure of the 20th century music was James Brown. He is often referred by many honorific nicknames like Mr. Dynamite, Soul Brother Number One, and of course, the Godfather of Soul.
Yes.
In a career that lasted over 50 years, I can only give you a few highlights of his luxurious career because we only got about 45 or 50 minutes in the podcast. So I'm going to give you a few highlights on James Brown. He influenced the development of several music genres. He first came to national public attention in mid-1950s as a lead singer of the famous Flames, a rhythm and blues vocal group founded by Bobby Byrd, with the hit ballads, Please, 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 and Try Me. Brown built a reputation of a dynamic live performer with a famous Flames and his backing band, sometimes known as the James Brown Band or the James Brown Orchestra. His success peaked in the 1960s in the live album Live at the Apollo and hit singles such as Papa Got a Brand New Bag, I Got You, I Feel Good, It's a Man's World. Oh, but I love that one, I Feel Good. I knew that I would now. I feel good. I knew that I would now. So good. So good. I got you. Oh, I feel nice.
No, he did.
Yeah, during the late 60s, Brown moved from a continuum of blues and gospels, based forms of style, to a profoundly Africanized approach to music making, emphasizing the stripped down interlocking rhythms that influenced the development of funk music. By the early 1970s, Brown had fully established the funk sound after the formation of the JBs, which recorded such a hits as Get Up, I Feel Like Being a Sex Machine, and The Payback, we like to call it the Big Payback. He also became noted for songs of social commentary, including the one back in 1968, which was Say It Loud. I'm black and I'm proud. Say it loud. I'm black and I'm proud. And he actually recorded that with kids in the studio. Bill Trimmer became the group's first manager, booking them at parties near college campuses in Georgia and South Carolina. The group had already gained a reputation as a good live act when they renamed themselves the Famous Flames. But in 1955, the group had contacted Little Richard while performing in Macon, Georgia. Now, Richard convinced the group to get in contact with his manager at the time, Clint Brantley, at his nightclub. Now, Brantley agreed to manage them after seeing the group perform at an audition. He then sent them to a local radio station to record the demo session where they performed their own composition of Please, 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 which was inspired when Little Richard wrote the words of the title on a napkin. And Brown was determined to make that song a hit. The Famous Flames eventually signed with King Records, or federal subsidiary in Cincinnati, Ohio, and issued the recorded version of Please, Please, Please in March 1956. The song became the group's first R&B hit, selling over 1 million copies. But none of their follow-up gained similar success. And by 1957, Brown had replaced Clint Brantley as manager and hired Bent Bart, chief of Universal Attraction Agency. That year, the original Flames broke up after Bart changed the name of the group to James Brown and the Famous Flames. But in October 1958, Brown released the ballad Try Me, which hit #1 on the R&B charts in the beginning of 1959, becoming the first of 17 chart-topping R&B hits. Shortly afterward, he recruited his first band, led by J.C. Davis, and reunited with Bobby Byrd, whom joined a revived Famous Flames lineup that included Eugene, Baby Lord Stallworth, and Bobby Bennett, with Johnny Terry sometimes coming along as the fifth flame. Brown, the Flames, and the entire band debuted at the Apollo Theater in April 24th, 1959, 12 days after I was born.
Wow.
Opening for Brown's idol, Little Willie John, whom he mimicked his singing after. He was important from the R&B music to 1950 to 1960, but Little Willie John faded away and died while serving a prison sentence for manslaughter. But he also was inducted to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1996. Now, Federal Records issued 2 albums created to Brown and the Famous Flames. Both contained previously released singles. By 1960, the Famous Flames and James Brown came together once again, beginning multitasking. Brown was in a recording studio involving himself, his singing group, the Famous Flames, and his band. And it was a separate entity from the Famous Flame, but they did come to an agreement. And sometimes James will name his James Brown Orchestra the James Brown Band, who actually backed up the Famous Flames. That year, the band released a top 10 R&B hit, "Do the Mashed Potatoes," on Dade Records. As a result of its success, King president Sid Nayton shifted Brown's contract from Federal to the parent label King, which, according to Brown in his autobiography, meant you got more support from the parent company than you did the subsidiary company, if y'all know what I mean. So King Records and Brown and the Famous Flames was a lineup, and they released the hit field album Think. So here you go, your nicknames now. So in 1962 to 1966, he was famously known as Mr. Dynamite, because in 1962, Brown and his band scored a hit with their cover of the instrumental Night Train, becoming a top 5 R&B single that same year. The ballads Lost Someone, Baby You're Right, that latter a Joe Tex composition, added to his repertoire and increased his reputation with R&B artists. On October 24th, 1962, Brown financed, this is interesting now, he financed his own live recording at the performance at the Apollo. He had to convince his manager, Sid Nayton, to release the album, despite Nayton's belief that no one will buy a live album due to the fact that Brown's single had already been bought and that live albums were usually bad sellers. But Brown had a knack for business as well.
Straight business. Because
Live at the Apollo was released the following June and became an immediate hit.
Wow.
Eventually reaching number 2 on the top LP charts and selling over 1 million copies, staying on the charts for 14 months. That's a year and 2 months.
Look at that.
In 1963, Brown scored his rendition of the standard Prisoner of Love. He also launched his first record label, Try Me Records, in 1963, which included recordings by the likes of Tammy Montgomery, later to be famous as Tammy Terrell, Johnny and Bill, Famous Flame Associates, Johnny Terry and Bill Holdings, and the Poets, which was another name used for Brown's backing band. During this time, Brown began an ill-fated 2-year relationship with 17-year-old Tammy Terrell when she sang in his review in 1962. Terrell ended the personal and professional relationship because of this abusive behavior. Then she later sung a duet with Marvin Gaye. In 1964, seeking bigger commercial success, Brown and Bobby Byrd formed the production company Fair Deal, linking the operation to Mercy imprint Smash Records. Now, King Records, however, fought against this. They did not like Bobby Byrd and James Brown going off to their own.
course.
So they fought against it. And when they fought, what they did, the court granted an injunction preventing Brown from releasing any recordings on his new label.
Look at that.
They couldn't accept a black man's rejection of them and having the ability to conduct their own business operations.
Being independent.
I'm telling you.
Sad.
But prior to the injunction, Brown had released 3 vocal singles, including blues-oriented hit Out of Sight, which further indicated the direction of his music was going to take off. Touring throughout the year, Brown and the Famous Flames grabbed more national attentions after giving an explosion show-stopping performance on the live concert film, the TAMI show. The Fame's dynamic gospel teen vocals, polished with choreography and timing as well, and Brown's energetic dance moves, including his signature move, the split, the high-octane singing upstage, the proposed closing act, which was the Rolling Stones. Having signed a new deal with King, Brown released his song, Papa Got a Brand New Bag, in 1965, which became the first top 10 pop hit and won him his first Grammy Award. Brown also signed a production deal with Lamar Records. Later in 1965, he issued I Got You, which became his second single in a row to reach #1 on the R&B chart, top 10 on the pop chart. Brown followed that up with the ballad, It's Still a Man's World. And on the third top 10 pop hit, #1 R&B, which confirmed his stance as a top-ranking performer, especially with R&B artists from that point. Let's move on to the next era. So in 1967 to 1970, he had the nickname of Soul Brother #1.
Soul Brother.
In 1967, Brown emerged sounds had begun to define as funk music. That year, he released that some critics cited as the first true funk song, which was Cold Sweat, which hit #1 on the R&B charts, top 10 pop, and became one of his first recordings to contain a drum break. Also the first that features the harmony that was reduced to a single chord. The instrumental arrangements on tracks such as Give It Up and Turn It Loose, Lickety Stick, both recorded in 1968, and Funky Drummer, recorded in 1969, featured a more developed version of Brown, mid-1960 style. James Brown developed of his signature groove, emphasized the downbeat, that heavy emphasis on the first beat, for everyone measured the one, and the application of swung 16th note and simplification of all bass line and drum patterns and guitar riffs and horn played with a sharp one-note tune to offset the drums, with the rock of psychedelic influence musicians like Sly and the Family Stones, Jimi Hendrix, and fostering improvisations in funk. Other musical groups he influenced was Kool and the Gang, Earth, Wind & Fire, Chic, BT Express, Loose Ends, Shalimar, SOS Band, Lakeside, Slave, The Whispers, Cameo, and Barcades began to adapt their style from Brown. They developed that Brown's innovations during the 1970s and added an R&B essence to their genre from the early 1970s, while others like Parliament Funkadelic and Hall Players kind of followed Jimi Hendrix's path. But he also influenced the Temptations, Michael Jackson, Prince. If you notice Prince, he kind of steps a little bit like James Brown when he dances.
Got them little heels on.
Yep, just like James Brown.
Little short man, yeah.
But changes in Brown's style that started with Cold Sweat also established the music foundation of Brown's later hits, I Got the Feeling, and Mother Popcorn back in 1969, 1968.
Yes.
By this time, James' vocals frequently took the form of kind of a rhythmic declamation, not quite sung, but not quite spoken, that only intermittently featured traces of pitch or melody like huh and hit and E and That's James Brown. One of my favorite saying, well, he say, let's take it to the bridge.
Okay.
Or hit me.
Yeah.
And when he wanted to change the melody, he'll say, take it back to the top. This will become the major influence on the technique of rapping, which would come to maturity along with hip-hop music in the coming decades. He's the most sampled artist by hip-hop.
That's right.
Brown's style of funk in the late 1960s was based on interlocking syncopatic parts, strumming bass lines, drum patterns, iconic percussion guitar riffs. But the main guitar, Anastasian, was Ain't It Funky? And Give It Up and Turn It Loose, both in 1969, are examples of Brown refinement of New Orleans funk. So my last genre, as I close, was 1970, my last era, 1970 and 1975, where his nickname was the Godfather of Soul. In March 1970, most Brown's mid-late 1960s road band walked out on him due to money disputes. And development argued by the prior disbandment of the Famous Flames singer group for the same reason in 1968. Brown and the Famous Flames singer Bobby Bird, who chose to remain in the band during this tumultuous period, subsequently recruited several members of the Cincinnati-based The Pacemakers, which included Bootsy Collins and his brother Phelps, or Catfish Collins.
Catfish.
And they augmented with the remaining members of the 1960 road band, including Fred Wesley, who rejoined Brown's outfit in December 1970. And the other new musician, they would form a nucleus of the JBs and Brown's new backing assembly. Shortly following their performance together, the band entered the studio to record Get Up, I Feel Like Being, which is a Sex Machine. The song and other contemporary singles would further cement Brown's influence and also in the funk industry. Well, James Brown also recorded with Polydor Records. Back in 1973, he scored for the Black's Caesar movie, Black's Politicians. Also recorded another soundtrack for the film Slaughter, Big Ripoff. Following the release of his soundtrack, Brown acquired a self-styled nickname, the Godfather of Soul. 1974, number one spot, R&B charts, The Payback on the Parent album. 1974, My Thing, Papa Don't Take No Mess.
Okay.
And then later on in Kinshasa, which is a part of Africa, he went there to perform as a build-up in the Rumble of the Jungle, fight between Muhammad Ali and George Foreman.
Wow.
A lot of people admired James Brown, like Miles Davis and other jazz musicians. Brown was inducted into the first class of the Rhythm and Blues Music Hall of Fame in 2013 as an artist, and then in 2017 as a songwriter. He also receives honors from several other institutions, including induction into the Black Music and Entertainment Walk of Fame, Songwriters Hall of Fame, and also Joel Whitburn's analysis of Billboard R&B charts back in 1942 to 2010. Brown was married 4 times. His first marriage was with Velma Warren in 1953, and they had one son together. Over a decade later, the couple had separated, and the final divorce was issued in 1969. But he maintained a close friendship with her even until the day he passed. Brown's second marriage was with Deidre Dee Dee Jenkins in 1970. They had 2 daughters together. The couple were separated in 1979 after one of the daughters described, unfortunately again, as domestic abuse, and the final divorce decree was in 1981. His third marriage was to Andrea Rodriguez in 1984. It was a contentious marriage that made headlines due to domestic abuse complaints. Rodriguez filed divorce in 1988, citing years of cruelty treatment. But they did reconcile. Thank God for that. And less than a year after Rodriguez died in 1996, Brown hired Tommy Ray Heine to be a background singer for his band, and she later became his fourth and final wife. At the end of his life, James Brown lived in Beach Island, South Carolina, directly across the Savannah River from Augusta, Georgia. Brown had diabetes and underwent undiagnosed for years, according to a longtime manager, Charles Bobbitt. 2004, Brown successfully treated for prostate cancer. Regardless of his health, Brown maintained his reputation as the hardest working man in show business by keeping up his grueling performance schedule, and was considered as a slave driver by some of his band members over the years. Brown continued to perform and record until his death from pneumonia in the year of 2006.
Wow. You cannot beat that history of such a phenomenal man that, definitely left a legacy and an imprint on our lives as African Americans. But this next gentleman, also influenced by James Brown.
We'll notice something.
But before we go further, I do want to recognize our guest viewers. Marshall, how you doing? Hey, family. And she also says, wow, very detailed study. Got to do some definitely research on these artists. And our family loves music. These kids will be notable.
That's right.
And then our son, Mr. Podfather, good afternoon. And he mentioned, Chadwick Boseman did a great job portraying him. You're absolutely right. Yes, that man was phenomenal. The moves, the singing, all of it.
That's right.
That's amazing. Yeah, he studied very well. God rest his soul. Forgot about that. Thank you. But we're going to talk about Sylvester Stewart.
All right.
He was born on March 15th, 1943 in Texas, and then was raised in the Bay Area in Vallejo, California.
All right, Dub Nation.
He was the second of the family's 5 children, and they encouraged their children to express themselves musically, which, of course, their whole family was musically inclined. I'm talking about Sly Stone. He changed his last name to Stone, and he grew up in the Church of God in Christ. So they had a group, of course, the family, called the Stewart Four.
Okay.
And they actually recorded and released a 78. I don't know if y'all know that. That's, it's not the 33, it's the 78.
There you go.
On the Battlefield, and also Walking in Jesus' Name in 1953.
Wow.
Now, you know me, I had to go and look up on YouTube to see if I could find it. And sure enough, I did. Look it up, the Stewart Four.
Wow.
So these children actually adopted the surname Stone and pursued their musical interests. So Sylvester was identified as a musical prodigy. I mean, by the time he was 7, here we go again. These artists that we've been talking about all month long in February, and now they've become so proficient in their musical talents at an early age. He knew keyboards, and by the time he was 11, he had mastered the guitar, the bass, and the drums. So while in high school, he had settled primarily on the guitar, and then of course he was in the high school band. So his stage name, as I mentioned, was Sly Stone, and he played a critical role in the development of funk with his pioneering fusion of soul, funk, psychedelica, and gospel in the 1960s and 70s. Now get this, for those of us that are from the Bay Area, Sly was a disc jockey at KDIA and KSOL. We used to call it K-Soul in the 1960s. Very familiar stations that we listened to all the time. And then he guided KSOL into soul music and actually named the station. So he was also a singer, a songwriter, a musician, a band leader, record producer, along with being a vocalist. I said that earlier, but keyboardist, guitarist, bass guitarist, harmonica player. I'm not surprised because you got to have some big lips to do that now. But Sly Stone, as I say, he played the keyboard for various artists, including Dionne Warwick and the Righteous Brothers. You remember them?
Yeah,
the Righteous Brothers. We are dating ourselves. Y'all got to look them up too. But in 66, Sly was performing with his band, Sly and the Stoners is what they were called. And his brother Freddie was working with his band. And they were called Freddie and the Stone Souls.
Okay.
So the brothers decided that they would fuse their bands together. And they added the baddest bass player in the land, Larry Graham. And later in 1968, their sister Rose Stone joined the band. So Sly was very active from 1966 to 1983, including some of the music, Dance to the Music. Right. I don't know if y'all know that. And I am everyday people. Yeah. And then thank you for letting me be myself again. Oh, he want to sing it. Thank you for letting me be myself again. And then I want to take you higher. And if you want me to stay. Now that was a little funky one. Me to stay. Yes. And then he had acclaimed albums including Stand. And There's a Riot Going On. I don't remember that. And Fresh. And our son says Sly Stone, he is very talented. You're right.
That's right.
You're exactly right. So along with James Brown, Sly Stone, and I'm sorry, now I lost my place. Along with James Brown and Parliament Funkadelic, Sly Stone and the Family Stone were pioneers of the late 60s and early 70s funk. And he had a major influence in the 1980s on artists, just as James Brown, Prince, and get this, Rick James.
Of course.
God rest his soul. But with much success comes many problems. I mean, we've studied a lot of groups, and it never fails. There's always a relationship that deteriorates in the band that causes the band to split. So he and Larry Graham got into a little tiff, and it's so sad to hear, but Larry Graham decided to leave the group. But the Black Panther Party was very prominent during that time, and they must have thought they had some power, because they let Sly Stone know, man, you're gonna have to let that those band members go. If they are not Black instrumentalists, you got to replace them. And so after, I don't know if he did or not. I think he did. I read that, but I didn't include that in my presentation. But after moving to Los Angeles area in the fall of 69, Stone and his bandmates, unfortunately, they began to be heavy users of illegal drugs, primarily cocaine and PCP. And it becomes really a sad story that is repetitive. And as the members become increasingly focused on their drug use and partying, Sly Stone used to carry a violin as if he was a violinist, but it wasn't a violin in there. It was all the drugs that they needed for that particular trip. So recording slowed down significantly because they were so involved in doing what they were doing. And so at that time in 69 and 71, they did release some pretty good hits. Everybody is a Star. And I don't know if you guys remember, Everybody is a Star. I mean, these lyrics are just profound. And then Thank You for Letting Me Be Myself. But this song was one of the first recordings to employ the heavy funk beats that would be featured in the funk music of the following decades. Trendsetters, you know, and so Larry Graham became his showcase bass player, innovative, you know, percussionist that played, you know, very unique style in his bass playing, called it slapping. And then Graham later said he developed this technique in an earlier band in order to compensate for that band's lack of a drummer. So there you go. That was the beat. So the band's cohesiveness, you know, slowly began to erode, as I mentioned earlier, and its sales and popularity began to decline as well. Some musicians withdrew from the band altogether in 1971, and eventually, you know, he had to replace Larry Graham with another person. I can't remember who that was, but at that time, Larry Graham started the Larry Graham or Graham Central Station.
Right.
And by the mid-70s, you know, Stone's drug use and erratic behavior, he was missing gigs and refusing to play and then passing out, literally, from drug use.
Wow.
I'm like, impacting their live bookings, which ended the group altogether, leaving Sly to record several unsuccessful solo albums after his sister and his brother left the group. But Sly was just not going to be defeated, even though with his high self, he just decided, look, I can play all these instruments myself. I'll do it myself. And he maintained a band when he needed to do live. But his recordings, he did it all by himself. Right. A musical genius. He toured with George Clinton and Funkadelic during the late 70s and early 80s, and actually appeared on the 1981 Funkadelic album.
Right.
But in 1993, he was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a member of the group. And then he took Sly and the Family Stone tribute. He took part in it in the 2005 or 2006 Grammy Awards, and his first live performance since 1987. Wow. Now, the sad ending of the story is that in 2011, the New York Post reported that Sly Stone was now homeless, and apparently that is still the case, and living out of a white camper. It's a camper van in Los Angeles, and the van is parked on a residential street in Crenshaw, which is that rough LA area where Boys in the Hood was filmed. And a retired couple, bless their hearts, they make sure that he eats once a day and he showers in their home. Now, before the show, I had to look up just to see if that was true, and every account that was a story. But if you look him up, you will see what he used to look like with his fro and you know, playing his music. And now if you see him, he's got a back issue and he's just slumped over, and he just really looks sad. So it's really sad how some of the artists, not all of them, you know, and he's blessed to still be alive if he was doing that much, but the life that they lived, you know, trying to be entertainers, it really takes a toll on your body. So I just encourage us all to really pray for the artists and all that can stay clear of the drugs and the alcohol. I know they say that brings about their creativity where they can be free, but God bless them. I mean, we appreciate, you know, all that they contributed. We salute James Brown and the phenomenal Sly Stone.
All right. So since we mentioned Funkadelic, let's let me end with this. Let's let me end with this, because I got a little bit on Funkadelic.
Oh, before you do, Jordan, Jordan Rosario, thank you so much for tuning in. And did you guys see Sly in concert? No. I can't remember. I don't think so, Trey. And yes, I'm sure you do remember those songs. Yeah, I'm sure you do. Go ahead.
Well, since we have a connection, before I close with the scripture.
Yes.
We both mentioned Funkadelic and George Clinton because of that connection. James Brown was an inspiration, and as well as Sly Stones, and they collaborated. Well, I just want to give you a few nuggets, and then we're going to close out. Funkadelic started out as a funk rock band from Plainville, New Jersey. In 1968, it active up to 1982. Now, they took James Brown funk to a totally new level. But the interesting thing is that Funkadelic was the band, and Parliament was the sister act. Parliament started out as a doo-wop group.
Wow.
Right. Now, George Clinton was the pioneer of this particular group and the funk that he took to another level from James Brown back in the 1970s. But he initially formed the backing band for the Clintons group, the Parliaments, which was Funkadelic. Now, Funkadelic was a heavy, more psychedelic rock oriented, as we mentioned before, like albums like Maggot Brain and One Nation Under the Groove.
Yes.
But the group was to become Funkadelic was formed by George Clinton in 1964 and was named as a backup section to the doo-wop group, the Parliaments. I tell you, learn something every day.
Right.
But we just want to give you that little nugget on Funkadelic and the Parliaments and Funkadelic Parliament, and also how George Clinton, after a while, they got into some disputes because of finances and because of recording contracts. And so he couldn't use the Parliament name. So that's where we came up with P-Funk, which is Parliament-Funk, which is Funkadelic. So I just want to give you those little nuggets. We have a lot more. Hopefully we can get back to Funkadelic and get more in depth on our next time around in our Black History Moment or Black History Month.
Yes.
But our closing scripture is very fitting because it really puts all of these artists in a light to where if they were not originally connected with God, they weren't connected to their creator, and understanding that this is where their gifts came from.
That's right.
And he gave them the ability and the talents to perform and conduct themselves, even though they veered off like a lot of us do.
Yes.
But they knew where their roots were. And now you can see Sly Stone is being blessed by someone else. That's his angel that's taking care of him now. But 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 4 through 5. 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 4 through 5 says, "And such trust have we through Christ to Godward. Not that we are sufficient of ourselves to think anything of ourselves, but our sufficiency is of God."
Yes.
May God bless you the rest of the weekend and have a blessed day. Thanks for tuning in.
That's right.
Love you guys. Thank you.
Thank you for your support. And enjoy the rest of your weekend.